this video is all about slightly more advanced materials. So I just have a default Blender scene here, and I'm just going to experiment a bit with some various properties on this cube. Now the first thing I'm going to do before we get too far into this is I'm just going to turn the background color, which remember is the shadow color as well, to black, and I'm going to swap from Eevee into cycles. And since I have a decent GPU, I'm going to set that to the GPU compute. And to accelerate this process a bit, this is the viewport sampling. I'm going to reduce this to 512, and that may or may not do a ton for us, but that could help with the previewing bit. And I'll just go ahead and reduce this to 1024 for the render itself. Now, one final thing I'm going to change is the light. I've been doing this very consistently. I'm just doing this to really quickly have a decent lighting setup so that we can view the material. So all I've done is take the default point light in the scene, I've turned it to a sun, put it to a strength of 10 and an angle of 11.4. You of course can play around with these values a bit, but the goal here is, if I just swap into rendered view, is to just get a good clear lighting scenario, and that will really help with this materials development. Of course this could be on any object or any set of objects you might have, but I'm just going to start applying a material to this. So by default it has a flat gray material on here, and you'll see that this is set to be a slightly gray. If I click on this, you'll see the color is not a pure white or black, it's kind of here at this gray point, BSDF material. And the easiest way to play around with any of the material settings and tweaking them is to actually just kind of mess around with some of these different values that are pulled out here to the front. So the most obvious one, of course, is the color itself, and which is just the kind of innate color of the object. And I'm going to go ahead and actually add I'll add a photo studio backdrop so we can just go ahead and see the object in its entirety with some bounce lighting. So if you remember, this is just entailing, I just make a plane, scale it up, go into edit mode, select the back, extrude it, and then bevel, smooth it out, just like you want in normal photography. So now when I take a look at it, you'll see we get some very nice shadowing, and the important thing here is that the plane is helping bounce the light so we can actually see light on all sides of the object. So now if I go and I just in rendered view mess with this, you can get a live preview. So you do have to be a bit careful with this. Some of these you definitely do not want to slide when you have rendered view on, because it can potentially crash your scene, especially if it's a very complex object. So I definitely recommend saving beforehand. This is a very straightforward cube example, so I should be okay, but I'll also be mostly typing in values rather than sliding the bar, and that will help a lot, because when you slide it, you're forcing it to compute multiple values at the same time. So I would really encourage you though to just experiment with this for a bit. So some of the main properties that you'll hear about are things like roughness or metallic, transmission, or IOR. So roughness is essentially the shininess of the object. So if I decrease the roughness, it will be shinier, and you can start to see some of the shadow of the object even reflected in, where if I turn up the roughness, it is less shiny, it is more matte, like a flat color. The default is set at 0.4. Let's make it a bit shiny, and we'll make it a bit metallic as well. And rather quickly, you can start to see what that's doing. You can see really prominently here on this side a bit of the reflection happening. This will become much more obvious, I think, if I was to add a colored set here to this backdrop and even add in another object. So I'll Shift D and copy this one. So now we can really see that reflection here in the object itself. Now, another material property that I really am quite fond of, and I think you will be as well, is the subsurface. You have to be a bit careful with this. This can really bump up rendering time, but it looks fantastic. It gives objects a very resin-like appearance, and that's because it actually allows some of the light to scatter inside of the material. And you'll even see in this preview, even with the grain, it looks quite nice. It has really emphasized the edges of the object. And how it works is it has this base color, but then it is also allowing this subsurface color, which is the internal highlight. So if I put this to something contrasting to that initial blue, it can be quite striking. And this already is shaping up to be a very nice material setup. If I was to render this, I think it would look quite nice, especially with this kind of pale background that the scene has as well. Now, you of course can just continue messing around with this, and I encourage you to do so. Just different properties like clear coat could be quite interesting. You can really go quite far with this. You can add some specular tinting, and just messing around with these different values can go quite far. Of course, another option is to play around with some of these other material typings, which if I just click on where it says surface here, it'll give you some base templates for various types. So for example, if you know you want something to be transparent, you can try glass. Now again, I encourage you to be careful with glass because transparency is very computing intensive to render. So this will really bump up your render times quite a lot. So use it sparingly, but of course I encourage you to experiment with it. Translucency can be quite nice, and diffuse is the one that we had used previously, is the most basic version of a material. It is like a matte, almost like a pure matte version, especially if you slide the roughness up. And another quite handy one is the glossy BSDF, and this is really good for just quickly generating metallic colors like gold, for example. We could really rapidly generate. And then of course the one that I was using initially is the principled BSDF. And you'll see as I've changed it out, it has reset all of these values, which may or may not be what you want. So if you're going to mess around with them, I encourage you to either click this button to add a new material, or to just click the plus button here and add another material slot. So all the materials in the scene are kind of collected in this list. So if you download materials offline, or an object comes with them, you can even apply those to different objects from here. The next topic that we need to talk about is the shader editor. And this is one of the alternate windows you can open up, and of course you could open it in any side panel or top panel or whatever, anywhere in the scene that you want, by just kind of dragging over and then selecting the shader editor from this list. But I actually quite like just having it down here at the bottom. And this is a more complex version of this exact same list here. You'll even see that it has a material slot at the top, and I can access all the other materials in the scene from here as well. And so this is actually currently a mirror of this, but the difference is that this is a node-based system, which allows us to do some very complex and interesting operations. To access what kind of nodes are available in the shader editor, you can press Shift A, and that will pull up a search bar. And there are a number of different operations you can use. If you've been importing objects, you may have seen this window before, because this is where different image textures can be applied to objects as well. So for example, if I go to grab an image texture here, I can drag it into the scene. This is a kind of green liquid, and I can instantly apply it to this as the base color. Of course, if I want to plug it into some other value, I can also do that. So for example, if I plug it into the roughness, You can't really tell here, but it is given a bit of variability to that roughness value. Now if I start applying it to other things like potentially the subsurface, maybe it's more obvious. This one's pretty weak, but this is actually a great segue because what I can do is add an additional node in. So if I press Shift A and look for a math node, I can clap it in between. So currently this is set to add, but I want to set it to multiply, and I'll put this by a value of 4. And I'll make the base color, I might even make the base color also this. If I really crank this value of the roughness up with this green material, you can maybe even start to see some of the lighting irregularities on it. This example is a bit difficult, so perhaps I'll need to grab some of its innate versions. So you'll see here I actually have all of these different layers for this green kind of already generated, and that's because I generated this using the Substance Designer package set. But what I can do is plug in the roughness to here, and now you can more clearly see with this texture as the example what this is doing. So if I look, it's irregularly rough. So for example, when I can see this break line, you can see that it is not a perfectly straight line. If I remove this and I'm holding Control right click to bring up this kind of cutting knife which can slice between the nodes, you'll see now the shininess has been irregular based off of the swirling texture here. If I drag this multiply node in, it makes that much more extreme, and you'll see now it's quite obvious how much more extreme that is. If I type in something like 60, it's really bumping the roughness based off of this initial texture. What I'm going to do though for this is provide a really quick example of how to turn this cube into a color gradient. So what we need to do is, if we press Shift A, what we need is a texture coordinate node. And this will be the holy grail of doing any sort of material mapping, in conjunction with what we call a mapping node. Is pretty essential for any sort of shader operations. You can get a plugin called the Node Wrangler, which will immediately populate this into your shader editor, but for now I'm just going to manually do it. And I'm going to plug in the generated into the vector. Now we can also mess around with some of these things, which we might do shortly, but I'm going to start with this, and the next thing I'm going to do is add a color ramp. And this is a pretty basic node. Essentially it's a color gradient, and I'm going to plug in vector to here and here to color. And you can't really tell what's going on yet, but if I slide this bar over, you will see that, lo and behold, there is a color gradient appearing on my object. And if I want to change what color is going to which, I can pick down here in the color wheel, and we could, for example, smoothly transition it from pink to blue, and I'll pull it here like so. I'm going to hide this second cube out, and I'm going to make this backdrop color white. Now this is pretty nice, and I'm not unhappy with this currently, but let's say we want to spice things up a bit. Well, here in the color ramp node, you can see that there is linear, ease, cardinal, linear, or B-spline, and constant. And these are just different ways it will blend in between the colors. So if I go to ease, it will really smooth that transition of the gradient out. Now, I'm not crazy about this roughness. I'm going to increase the roughness so it's less shiny for us. Let's say though we want to control the direction of this mapping? Well, this is where some of these other properties on the mapping node come in handy. So you'll see as I'm rotating this, it's rotating the intersection plane of that gradient. And I could mess with that to my heart's content. If you want, you can also add in additional colors into the mix. So we could have, and I just click the plus button here on the color ramp, and I can just make that a kind of third color in the middle. So we'll have this go from yellow, pink to yellow to blue here. There we go. Have a nice rainbow. We can set this back to, if we see linear, it's much harsher transitions. B-spline kind of puts a bit of a mathematical curve between them. And let's see, if I make this color a bit closer, it'll be a bit smoother as well. So this is one way we can use this shader editor. Another really amazing way we can use it, though, is to do stuff like a noise texture. So if I go to Shift and type in a noise texture, this is going to give us a 3D generated noise, this is going to give us a 3D generated noise which we could use to map the color onto the object, or the color ramp. So if I plug this vector in here and the factor into factor, all of a sudden you see that it has distributed this noise pattern across. I'm going to remove this middle color here, and I'm going to make this more of a green-blue, and we'll set it back to ease. If I want to adjust like the scale of this noise texture, I can play with this slider here. So I might want it to be a bit bigger actually, like this, and I'll increase the detail like so. I would encourage you to play around a bit with some of the noise textures, maybe the color ramps and the kind of gradient mapping where you can do some really cool gradient colorings of objects. But you could also do quite a lot with just using the slider bars, so adjusting things like the roughness and the metallic value just to create some material contrast.